The gold band caught the light one last time before Margaret placed it on the counter. Her hands didn't shake. They should have. After 43 years, you'd think removing that ring would feel like losing a limb. But hunger has a way of making even the most sacred things negotiable. What she didn't know was that this stranger she was about to feed would save her life 3 times before the week was over. And that the ring would find its way back to her in the most impossible way imaginable. Margaret Chen stood in the pawnshop on a Tuesday morning in late October, watching a man with tired eyes examine the only piece of jewelry she'd worn every single day since 1981. The shop smelled like old leather and desperation, a scent she was becoming too familiar with. Outside, the first cold rain of autumn tapped against the window like impatient fingers. She thought about Henry. Always Henry. How he'd saved for 6 months to buy that ring, working double shifts at the shipyard, coming home with hands so callous they'd catch on her hair when he held her face. 14 carat, the pawnbroker said, his voice flat and practiced. I can give you $200. Less than what Henry paid in 1981. Less than the cost of the flowers at his funeral 3 years ago. But it was enough. Enough for what she needed to do. That's fine, Margaret heard herself say. The transaction took less than 3 minutes. 43 years on her finger. 3 minutes on someone else's scale. She left the shop with cash folded in her coat pocket and an unfamiliar lightness on her left hand. The rain had intensified. She hadn't brought an umbrella. She never thought she'd need one when she left the house that morning. She hadn't planned on selling her soul before lunch. But then she'd seen him. His name was Daniel, though she wouldn't learn that until later. She'd first noticed him 4 days earlier, sitting in the doorway of the abandoned pharmacy on 7th Street. Not panhandling. Not making a scene. Just existing in that peculiar way homeless people do, trying to take up as little space as possible in a world that's already decided they're taking up too much. He was younger than she expected homeless people to be. Maybe 40. Maybe younger. The streets age you in dog years. What struck her wasn't his appearance. It was his eyes. Margaret had spent 30 years as a hospice nurse before her own health declined. She'd learned to read eyes the way sailors read the sky. This man's eyes were drowning. Not with self-pity. With something deeper. The kind of drowning that happens when you've stopped fighting the current and are just waiting for the water to fill your lungs. She'd walked past him that first day, then felt guilty about it for the next 48 hours. Margaret had her own struggles. Her pension barely covered rent since they'd cut benefits. The part-time work she could still manage brought in enough for groceries as she was careful. Rice and beans became gourmet when you learned to season them right. She'd sold most of Henry's tools last year. His fishing rods the year before that. The television went in August. She told herself she didn't need it anyway. But you can only pare a life down so far before you're left with nothing but memories and the will to keep breathing. She'd walked past Daniel again on Monday. This time she noticed he wasn't moving much. The small backpack that had been beside him on Thursday was gone. She wondered if someone had stolen it, or if he'd traded it for something. Food, maybe. Or worse. His jacket was too thin for October. She thought about Henry's old coat, still hanging in her closet. Heavy wool. Navy blue. She'd kept it because it still smelled like him if you buried your face in the collar. Old Spice and sawdust and the sea. That night, she couldn't sleep. Henry's voice kept running through her head. Not a memory exactly. More like the echo of the man he'd been. Maggie, he used to say, you can't save everyone. But you can save someone. He'd said it the first time she'd brought home a stray dog. And the time she'd insisted they'd taken her sister after her divorce. And when she'd stayed late at the hospice, holding the hand of a patient who had no family, missing their anniversary dinner because no one should die alone. Henry never complained. He understood. That was the thing about Henry. He saw the world the way she did. Full of people who needed someone to notice they were drowning. Tuesday morning, Margaret woke with clarity. She checked her kitchen cabinets. 3 cans of soup. A box of crackers. Half a bag of rice. Some tea. Enough for her to make it to Friday when her check came. But not enough to share. Not really. She checked her wallet. $14. Her bank account was in the single digits until Friday. She'd already paid this month's rent and utilities. She had nothing to spare. That's when she looked down at her hand. The ring caught the morning light coming through her window. She remembered the day Henry put it there. The courthouse wedding because they couldn't afford anything else. Her borrowed dress. His nervous smile. The way he'd fumbled with the ring because his hands were shaking. I've welded ships, he'd laughed. I've worked with metal for 20 years. Why can't I get this ring on your finger? She kissed him before he could try again. Because this matters more than ships, she'd said. Margaret stood in her small kitchen, touching the ring, feeling the weight of 4 decades. Henry would understand. She knew he would. He'd probably tell her she waited too long. That she should have done something 3 days ago. She put on her coat. The wool one, dark green, that had seen better years but still kept out most of the cold. She walked to 7th Street first. Daniel was there. Awake but barely. She could see him shivering. His lips had a bluish tint. How long had it been since he'd eaten? Really eaten? She'd seen this before, in her nursing days. The body started to shut down, rationing energy, making impossible choices about which organs mattered most. "Excuse me," she said softly. She'd learned in hospice that tone mattered more than words. "I'm Margaret." He looked up. Those eyes. God, those eyes. Up close, they were worse. They held so much pain it made her chest hurt. "I'm fine," he said automatically. The lie everyone tells when they're drowning. "I'm sure you are," Margaret replied, "because you don't challenge the drowning. You just throw them a rope. But I was wondering if you'd let me buy you breakfast. There's a diner around the corner. I could use the company." Something flickered in his expression. Suspicion maybe? Or hope. They look similar when you're not used to either. "I don't need charity." "Good," Margaret said. "Because I'm not offering it. I'm offering breakfast. And honestly, I hate eating alone." That was true, actually. Since Henry died, meals had become merely functional. Rice at the table for one. Soup from the can, standing at the counter. You forget food is supposed to be social when there's no one left to share it with. He studied her face. She let him. She'd learned to let people assess whether she was safe. Finally, he nodded. "Okay." He stood slowly, like his joints hurt. He probably wasn't even 45, Margaret realized. Maybe younger. But pain and poverty and living rough can make you ancient. They walked the 2 blocks to Rosie's diner in silence. Margaret matched his pace, which was slower than hers. She noticed he favored his left leg. The rain had stopped, but everything dripped. The city had that clean smell rain leaves behind, washing away the summer dust. For a moment, everything felt suspended. Like the world was holding its breath. Rosie's was the kind of place that still had vinyl booths and a jukebox no one played anymore. Margaret had been coming here since 1979. First with Henry. Then, after he was gone, sometimes alone when the apartment felt too quiet. Linda, the waitress who'd worked there for 30 years, gave her a curious look when she walked in with Daniel. Margaret just smiled. "Corner booth?" Linda asked, grabbing 2 menus. "Perfect." They slid into the booth, worn red vinyl cracking under their weight. The diner was mostly empty. A couple of construction workers at the counter. An old man reading a newspaper by the window. The coffee smelled like every diner Margaret had ever been in. Burnt and bitter and somehow comforting. "Order whatever you want," Margaret said, handing Daniel the laminated menu. He stared at it like he'd forgotten how to read. Or maybe like he didn't trust this was real. His hands, she noticed, were clean but rough. Working hands. Or they had been once. He started then stopped. His voice cracked. "I haven't eaten since Saturday. 3 days. Jesus." Margaret kept her expression neutral. In hospice, you learn not to show shock. Shock made people feel like burdens. Then let's fix that, she said gently. When Linda came over, Margaret ordered for both of them. Coffee, orange juice, the Denver omelet, hash browns, toast, pancakes. She watched Daniel's eyes widen slightly. That's too much, he said quietly. It's breakfast, Margaret replied. And I'm hungry. She wasn't really. But she'd eat what she could. Make him comfortable. That was the goal. Just one good meal. Let him feel human again for an hour. The food came quickly. Margaret had forgotten how fast Linda was. The coffee appeared first, steam rising from thick ceramic mugs. Daniel wrapped both hands around his cup like it was winter fire. She watched him take that first sip. The way his eyes closed. The small exhale. How something as simple as hot coffee could feel like redemption. Thank you, he whispered. You're welcome. When the plates arrived, heaping and hot, Daniel stared at them. For a terrible moment, Margaret thought he might cry. But he gathered himself, picked up his fork, and began to eat. Slowly at first. Then faster. She knew to look away and give him privacy. She picked at her own omelet, sipping coffee, pretending to watch the rain-soaked street outside. They didn't talk much during the meal. Words weren't the point. Food was. Warmth. The simple dignity of sitting in a booth like a regular person on a Tuesday morning. Margaret thought about the ring on the pawnshop counter. Worth it, she decided. Whatever happened next, this moment was worth it. When Daniel finally slowed down, having eaten everything on his plate and half of hers, when his hands stopped shaking and color returned to his face, he looked at her. Why? He asked. It's the question everyone asks when kindness arrives unexpectedly. Why me? Why now? Why would you? Margaret thought about Henry. About their wedding day. About the last thing he'd said to her in the hospital, morphine softening his words but not his meaning. Don't stop seeing people, Maggie. Promise me. Because you needed breakfast, Margaret said simply. And I could help. You don't know me. No, she agreed. But I know hungry. And I know cold. And I know what it's like when the world decides you're invisible. Something shifted in Daniel's expression. The drowning eyes surfaced. Just a little. Just enough. I used to be a teacher, he said suddenly. High school English. I had a classroom. Students. I loved poetry. He laughed, bitter and small. Isn't that stupid? I taught kids about Frost and Dickinson, and now I'm sleeping in doorways. What happened? Margaret asked, though she knew better than to expect a simple answer. There never was one. People didn't end up on streets because of one bad decision. It was always a cascade. One thing after another until you're drowning and no one throws a rope. My wife died, Daniel said, staring at his empty plate. Cancer. Fast and mean. We had insurance, but it wasn't enough. Never is. I took a leave of absence to care for her. Then she was gone. And I couldn't go back. Couldn't stand in front of kids and pretend the world made sense. I fell apart. Started drinking. Lost the job. Lost the apartment. My family. He trailed off. They tried. But I pushed them away. Pushed everyone away. And now here I am. Rock bottom with a stranger who bought me breakfast. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her ring finger felt naked. Strange. But right somehow. I'm sorry, she said. And meant it with everything she had. Me too. They sat in that shared sorrow for a moment. Two people who'd loved and lost. Who knew the weight of absence. Who understood that some holes never fill. You just learn to walk around them. I lost my husband 3 years ago, Margaret said. Heart attack. He was there one morning, making coffee. And then he wasn't. Just gone. And you're supposed to move on, right? That's what everyone says. But how do you move on from 43 years? How do you wake up and not reach for someone who isn't there? Daniel nodded. Understanding passing between them without words. Linda refilled their coffee. The old man by the window folded his newspaper and left. Outside, a bus rumbled past. Life continues its indifferent march forward. What I learned, Margaret continued, is that moving on is a lie. You don't move on. You move forward. And there's a difference. Moving on means leaving behind. Moving forward means carrying on with you. My husband comes with me everywhere. In my heart. In my choices. In moments like this. He'd approve of this? Daniel asked, a small smile touching his lips for the first time. He'd have bought you lunch too, Margaret said. And it was true. Henry would already have invited Daniel home, would have found him a coat, would have made calls to shelters and social services and anyone who might help. Henry fixed things. People, boats, broken fence posts. If it needed mending, Henry found a way. But Henry was gone. And Margaret was here. Doing what she could. Which was breakfast and conversation and the presence of another human being who saw him as human. After they finished, Margaret paid the bill. $43. More than she'd planned. But she'd spent the wedding ring money. Might as well spend it right. She left a generous tip for Linda, who'd kept the coffee coming and hadn't asked questions. Outside the diner, they stood on the sidewalk. The rain had started again, light and misting. Daniel looked at her, and something had changed in his face. The drowning had receded. Not gone, but pushed back. Given a temporary reprieve. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You just did. Can I ask your last name? So I can remember you properly? Chen, Margaret said. Margaret Chen. I'm Daniel Morrison. He held out his hand formally. She shook it. His grip was firm. There was pride in that handshake. A reclaiming of something lost. It was nice to meet you, Daniel Morrison. You too, Margaret Chen. They parted there. He is heading back towards 7th Street. Her walking home to her apartment. She didn't look back. Didn't watch him go. You had to let people leave when they needed to. She'd learned that in hospice. Sometimes the greatest gift was knowing when to hold on, and when to let go. Margaret walked the 6 blocks home, her hand in her pocket, feeling the empty space where her ring should be. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been elegant once, in the 1920s, before the elegance wore off and only the bones remained. She climbed the stairs slowly, her knees protesting. 67 felt older some days than others. Inside, her apartment was small but clean. Tidy. Henry's fishing photo on the mantel. Their wedding picture is beside it. She touched the frame gently, looking at her younger self, at Henry's proud smile. I think you'd approve, she told the photograph. The apartment didn't answer. It never did. But she felt better saying it aloud. She made tea. Sat by the window. Watched the rain. Her hand looked strange without the ring. Naked. But she'd done the right thing. She was certain of that. One meal wouldn't solve Daniel Morrison's problems. Wouldn't get him off the street or sober or back into a classroom. But it might remind him he mattered. That someone saw him. And sometimes that's enough to keep a drowning person afloat one more day. Margaret didn't expect to see Daniel again. In her experience, moments like theirs were meant to be singular. Brief intersections of need and help. You did what you could, and then you both moved on with your lives. Or forward. Whatever. But life has a strange way of circling back. 2 days later, Thursday evening, Margaret was walking home from the grocery store. She'd spent $7 on the essentials. Rice. Beans. 1 can of soup. Tea. Her check would come tomorrow, and she'd eat better then. For now, she made do. She was good at making do. It was practically her superpower at this point. The sun was setting early, the way it does in late October. Shadows stretched long and purple across the pavement. She was thinking about dinner. Maybe the soup tonight. Save the rice for tomorrow. She wasn't paying attention to her surroundings the way she should have been. She didn't notice the 2 men following her until they were close. Too close. Hey there, one of them said, stepping into her path. Young. Maybe 25. eyes that darted around like trapped animals. The other one moved behind her, boxing her in. Margaret's heart kicked into emergency speed. Her nurse training screamed at her to stay calm. "Assess. Don't escalate." "I don't have much," she said, hating how her voice shook. "Maybe $15. "We'll take it," the first one said. "And your phone?" "Hand it over." Her phone. Her lifeline. The only way the hospital could reach her if something happened. The only way she could call for help. Her hand tightened on her purse. "Please," she said. "I need my phone." "Now, lady." The one behind her moved closer. She could smell cigarettes and sweat. Fear spiked through her chest, sharp and cold. This was how people got hurt. How elderly women ended up in emergency rooms with broken hips and shattered faces. She knew this. She treated these victims. And now she was becoming one. Her hand moved toward her purse. She was going to give them what they wanted. What choice did she have? But before she could unzip it, a voice cut through the evening air. "Hey!" All three of them turned. Daniel Morrison stood at the corner, his thin jacket soaked from rain, his face set in hard lines. He looked bigger somehow. More solid. Like desperation had burned away everything soft and left only steel. "Walk away," Daniel said, his voice carrying authority Margaret hadn't heard before. The teacher's voice. The one that commanded classrooms of skeptical teenagers. The two men hesitated. Calculating. Daniel was one person. They were two. But sometimes numbers don't matter as much as willingness. And Daniel looked very willing. "This doesn't concern you," the first man said. "It does now." Daniel moved closer. His hands were open but ready. Margaret saw something in his eyes. Something that said he'd already lost everything that mattered, which made him dangerous in a way these young thugs couldn't comprehend. When you have nothing left to lose, you become unflinching. The moment stretched. Tense. The city held its breath. Then the second man tugged his partner's sleeve. "Come on." "Not worth it." They left. Quickly. Disappearing into the shadowed streets like rats into cracks. Margaret sagged against the building wall, her legs suddenly unreliable. Her heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. Daniel was beside her in an instant. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "No," she managed. "You stopped them." "How did you? Why are you here?" "I've been following you," Daniel admitted, looking embarrassed. Not in a creepy way. You walk this route every day. Around this time. And this neighborhood isn't safe after dark. I thought maybe I could." He trailed off. "I wanted to make sure you got home okay. After what you did for me. It seemed like the least I could do." Margaret stared at him. This man she'd fed once. This stranger who was sleeping in doorways. He'd been protecting her. Walking her route. Making sure she was safe. Her throat tightened with emotion. "You've been watching out for me?" "Someone needed to," Daniel said simply. "You live alone, right?" I recognized the pattern. Same as my mother after my dad died. Always alone. Always careful. But not careful enough. Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. She hadn't cried since Henry's funeral. But this broke something open. This stranger is caring. This man with nothing is giving her something priceless. Safety. Attention. The knowledge that someone was watching out for her in a world that mostly looked away. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for breakfast," Daniel replied. "And for seeing me. Really seeing me. You gave me something I'd forgotten I needed. Dignity. So yeah, I'm walking your route. Making sure you're okay. It's not much. But it's what I've got." They stood there in the settling darkness, two broken people who'd somehow found each other in a city of millions. Proof that kindness echoes. That what you give out comes back in unexpected ways. "Let me walk you home," Daniel said. "Actually home. To your door." "I'd like that." They walked the remaining 3 blocks together. Margaret felt safer than she had in months. Maybe years. Since Henry died, the city has felt more threatening. She'd felt more vulnerable. Now, with Daniel beside her, that fear receded. At her building, she stopped. "Do you have anywhere to sleep tonight?" "The temperature's dropping. I'll find a spot," Daniel said. Which meant no. Which meant doorways and cardboard and hoping he didn't freeze. Margaret made a decision. The kind Henry would have made without hesitation. "I have a couch," she said. "It's not much. But it's warm and dry. And you'd be doing me a favor. After tonight, I'd feel better knowing someone was here." Daniel looked uncertain. "I don't want to impose." "You're not. You're accepting an offer. There's a difference." She smiled. "Besides, you protected me tonight. The least I can do is offer you a couch." He studied her face, looking for pity or obligation. Finding only sincerity. "Okay," he said finally. "Thank you." Margaret unlocked the building door. They climbed to the 3rd floor. Her apartment door opened to warmth, and the smell of old tea, and the faint ghost of Henry's cologne that never quite left. Daniel stepped inside carefully, like he was entering a church. "Bathroom's there," Margaret said, pointing. "There are towels in the closet. You can shower if you want. I'll find you some of my husband's clothes. You're about the same size." Daniel's eyes went to the photographs on the mantel. "He looks like a good man." "He was the best man," Margaret said. "And he'd want you here. Trust me." While Daniel showered, Margaret pulled out Henry's clothes from the boxes in the closet. She'd been meaning to donate them, but couldn't. Not yet. Now she was grateful she'd kept them. She found jeans, a flannel shirt, and a warm sweater. Socks. She laid them on the couch with a blanket and a pillow. When Daniel emerged from the bathroom, cleaned and changed, he looked different. Younger. More like the teacher he used to be. His hair was still damp. He'd shaved with Henry's razor she'd left out. The transformation was startling. "I can make us some soup," Margaret offered. "It's not much. It's everything," Daniel said quietly. They ate together at her small kitchen table. 2 bowls of vegetable soup. Crackers. Tea. Simple and warm. They talked about small things. Books they'd read. Movies they'd loved. Daniel told her about teaching English, how he tried to make his students love language the way he did. Margaret told him about nursing, about the patients who'd stayed with her. The ones she'd helped ease into death with dignity and kindness. "You're good at that," Daniel observed. "Making people feel seen." "It's the only thing I've ever been good at," Margaret said. "Henry used to say I collected broken things. Broken people. Broken animals. Broken hearts. And I'd try to fix them. Or at least sit with them while they fixed themselves." "Did it work?" "Sometimes," Margaret admitted. "Sometimes people are too broken. Or they don't want fixing. But I always tried." Henry said trying mattered more than succeeding. Smart man. The smartest. After dinner, Margaret found extra blankets. Made sure Daniel had everything he needed. He settled on the couch, looking overwhelmed. "I don't know how to repay you for this," he said. "You already did. You kept me safe tonight. You saw me struggling, and you helped. That's payment enough." That night, Margaret slept better than she had in months. Knowing someone else was in the apartment. That she wasn't alone. It reminded her of when Henry was alive. The comfort of another person breathing in the darkness. The presence that makes a place a home instead of just an address. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment, she forgot. Thought Henry was up early, making his terribly strong coffee that could wake the dead. Then reality settled. Daniel. She found him in the kitchen, standing by her coffee maker. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "I found the coffee. Thought I'd make us some." "Mind?" "I'm grateful." Margaret sat at the table. Daniel poured 2 cups. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the morning light fill the small kitchen. "I've been thinking," Daniel said slowly, "about what you said. About moving forward instead of moving on. I've been stuck, Margaret. Stuck in grief and guilt and self-pity. Using them as excuses. But last night, sleeping on a real couch, in a warm place, having someone trust me enough to let me in, it reminded me of who I used to be. Who I still could be. Who's that? Someone who helps. Someone who teaches. Someone who matters. He looked at her directly. I need to stop drowning. I need to start swimming again. Margaret felt something bloom in her chest. Hope. Not for herself. For him. I think that's wise, she said gently. I don't know how to start, Danielle admitted. I've been on the streets for 6 months. I've burned bridges. Lost connections. But maybe I could try. Maybe you could, Margaret agreed. And maybe you don't have to do it alone. Over the next week, Margaret and Daniel fell into an unexpected rhythm. He slept on her couch. She fed him what she could from her meager supplies. In return, he helped around the apartment. Fixed her leaky faucet. Tightened her loose doorknobs. Walked with her to the store. They became companions. Two lonely people finding comfort in shared space. Daniel started going to AA meetings at the church 3 blocks away. Started talking to social workers about getting back on his feet. It was slow. Recovery always is. But he was trying. Margaret saw the effort. The daily choice to swim instead of drown. On Tuesday, exactly 1 week after she'd sold her ring, Margaret's check came. She cashed it at the corner store. Bought real groceries. Made dinner for 2. Pot roast. Henry's favorite. She'd almost forgotten how to cook for more than herself. They ate together, and Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Contentment. The apartment felt alive again. Filled with conversation and laughter, and the comfortable silence of companionship. After dinner, there was a knock at the door. Margaret answered it, confused. She never had visitors. A young woman stood in the hallway. Maybe 30. She had Daniel's eyes. The same green-gray color, but without the drowning. I'm looking for Daniel Morrison, the woman said. I was told he might be here. Daniel appeared behind Margaret. His face went pale. Sarah? Hi, Dad. The world stopped. Margaret felt it. The weight of this moment. Daniel's daughter. Here. How? How did you find me? Daniel asked, his voice breaking. A social worker from the AA meeting called me, Sarah said. You said you'd been attending? Given them my contact information. I've been looking for you for months, Dad. Months. And then this call came and She stopped. Tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I should have tried harder. Should have found you sooner. No, Daniel said, moving forward. I pushed you away. After your mother died, I pushed everyone away. This isn't your fault. They stood in the hallway, father and daughter, both crying. Margaret felt her own tears falling. This was why she'd sold her ring. Not for the breakfast. Not even for Daniel's recovery. But for this moment. This reconnection. This proof that broken things could be mended. Sarah stepped forward and hugged her father. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, sobbing into her hair. Margaret watched, hand over her mouth, overcome. In hospice, she'd seen countless endings. Families torn apart by death and disease and all the cruelties time delivers. But sometimes, rarely, she'd seen healings too. Reconciliations. Last-minute forgiveness. This felt like that. Like witnessing grace. After a while, Sarah looked at Margaret. Are you Margaret Chen? I am. Dad told the social worker about you. About breakfast. About you taking him in. About. Sarah's voice cracked. About you saving his life. Thank you? Thank you for seeing him when I couldn't. Thank you for helping him when I wasn't there. You're welcome, Margaret said softly. But your father saved his own life. He chose to swim. I just kept him company in the water. They talked for an hour. Sarah explained she'd been searching. Had filed missing person reports. Had checked shelters and hospitals and morgues, terrified of what she'd find. When the social worker called, she immediately drove 3 hours. Hoping. Praying. That this time she'd find him alive and willing to try again. "I have a spare room," Sarah said to Daniel. "In my apartment. It's small. But it's yours if you want it. I know I can't fix everything that's broken, Dad. But maybe we could try. Together?" Daniel looked at Margaret. She saw the question in his eyes. The uncertainty. The fear of hoping too hard. "Go," she said firmly. "Go home. Be with your daughter. Let yourself be loved. But you will be fine," Margaret interrupted. "I've been fine for 3 years. I'll keep being fine. But you have a chance here, Daniel. Don't waste it." "I can never repay you," Daniel said. "Then don't try," Margaret replied. "Just live well. That's all the payment I need." Daniel hugged her tightly, like she was something precious. When he pulled back, he was smiling through tears. "You're a remarkable person, Margaret Chen." "So are you, Daniel Morrison. Now get out of here before I start crying harder." He left with Sarah. Margaret watched them go down the stairs, father and daughter, arms around each other, holding on. When they disappeared from view, she closed her door and leaned against it. The apartment was quiet again. Empty again. But different somehow. The silence felt less oppressive. The walls are less confining. She'd helped someone. Genuinely helped. And in helping him, she'd helped herself. Had remembered what it felt like to matter. To make a difference. To be more than just a woman waiting alone for her own ending. Margaret went to bed that night feeling at peace. The couch looked empty without Daniel's blankets. But it was a good empty. The kind that comes after a guest leaves and you're glad they visited but happy for the solitude again. She thought about her ring. Somewhere in the city, on someone else's hand or in someone else's collection. She didn't regret selling it. How could she? That ring had bought more than breakfast. It had bought redemption. For Daniel. For her. For the memory of Henry, who would have been proud. She fell asleep thinking about Henry's smile. About the wedding day. About 43 years of love that still guided her even though he was gone. The next morning, Wednesday, Margaret went back to her routine. Grocery shopping with her carefully budgeted money. Tea at the window. Watching the city move. It was enough. It had to be. Around noon, there was another knock. Margaret sighed. People were suddenly discovering her address. She opened the door expecting a neighbor or maybe a salesman. Sarah stood there. Alone. "Hi," Sarah said. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Come in." Sarah entered, looking around the modest apartment. "Dad told me about your husband. About the ring. Margaret, what you did." She stopped, gathering herself. "What you did changed everything. For my dad. For me. And I need you to know how grateful I am." "Your gratitude is enough," Margaret said. "Truly. It's not, though." Sarah reached into her purse. Pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. "I know you sold your wedding ring to help my father. And I know rings can't be replaced. But I needed to do something." She handed the tissue paper to Margaret. Inside was a ring. Not Margaret's ring. But beautiful nonetheless. Simple gold band. Delicate. Elegant. "It was my mother's," Sarah said quietly. "My father gave it to her when they got married. She wore it for 18 years until she died. I've been keeping it. Not sure what to do with it. But I think she'd want you to have it. You saved her husband. You gave me my father back. This ring should go to someone who understands what marriage means. What love means. What sacrifice looks like." Margaret stared at the ring. It caught the light from her window. Gold and simple and sacred. "I can't take this," she whispered. "Please," Sarah said. "It's not a replacement. Nothing could replace what you had. But maybe it could be a reminder. That love continues. That which you gave my father, you gave my mother too. She would have done the same thing if she'd been here. You're who she was. Kind. Selfless. Someone who sees people drowning and throws them a rope." Margaret's hands shook as she held the ring. Thought about Henry. She thought about the woman she'd never met who'd loved Daniel. About the chain of love that connects strangers across time and grief. About how we carry each other forward even when we're gone. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "I've never been more sure of anything," Sarah said. "My mother would be honored. And so would I." Margaret slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Like it was meant to be there. Like some force in the universe had conspired to put this particular ring on this particular hand. She looked at it, tears blurring her vision. It wasn't Henry's ring. But it carried the same weight. The same meaning. Love and commitment, and the promise that some things endure beyond death. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "Thank you for this gift." Sarah hugged her. "Thank you for mine." After Sarah left, Margaret sat by her window wearing her new ring. She thought about the chain of events. How selling one ring had led to getting another. How feeding a stranger had led to saving a life. How one small act of kindness had rippled outward in ways she never could have predicted. She thought about Henry's words. "You can't save everyone. But you can save someone." She'd saved Daniel. And in saving him, she'd been saved too. Reminded that her life still had purpose. That she still mattered. That loneliness could be temporary if you were brave enough to reach out. Even when reaching out meant selling your most precious possession. The ring caught the afternoon light. Margaret smiled. Henry would have loved this story. Would have laughed at the poetry of it. One ring lost. Another ring found. Love coming back around in circles. She made herself tea. Sat with the steam rising and the ring gleaming and the peace that comes from knowing you've lived correctly. Not perfectly. Correctly. According to the code Henry had taught her. See the drowning. Throw the rope. Ask questions later. That evening, Margaret decided to walk. She put on her green coat, locked her apartment, and headed out into the October chill. The city was settling into darkness. Streetlights flickering on. The smell of wood smoke from somewhere. She walked without destination, just moving through the world, feeling alive and purposeful and connected. She found herself on 7th Street. The old pharmacy doorway where Daniel used to sleep was empty now. Someone had swept away the cardboard. A few cigarette butts remained, the only evidence someone had lived there. Margaret stood looking at that doorway, thinking about the fragility of everything. How quickly a life can unravel. How fast it can be stitched back together with the right thread. "Mrs. Chen?" She turned. A man stood behind her. Older than Daniel. Maybe 60. Bearded and bundled in layers. She recognized him vaguely. He'd been near this corner before. Part of the invisible population that moved through the city's margins. "Yes? You're the lady who helped Daniel," he said. Not a question. A statement. "He told me before he left. You said you bought him breakfast. Gave him a place to sleep. Helped him find his daughter." "I did what anyone should have done," Margaret said. "But no one else did," the man replied. "Just you. And I wanted to say thank you. Because Daniel leaving gave me hope. If he could get out, maybe I can too. Maybe we all can. You showed him he mattered. And that showed me I might matter too." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She hadn't considered this. The ripples beyond Daniel. How one person's redemption could inspire others. How hope was contagious if given the chance to spread. "What's your name?" she asked. "Robert. Robert Franklin." "It's nice to meet you, Robert. Have you eaten today?" Robert looked surprised. Then cautious. "I'm okay." "That's not what I asked." Margaret reached into her purse. Pulled out a $20 bill. Her grocery money for the next 3 days. She handed it to him. "There's a diner 2 blocks that way. Rosie's. Tell Linda that Margaret sent you. She'll take care of you." Robert stared at the money like it might vanish. "I can't take this." "You can. And you will. Because someone needs to. And today, that someone is you." She smiled. "And Robert? You do matter." whether you believe it yet or not." She left him standing there, holding the 20, looking at it like it was a winning lottery ticket. She walked home feeling lighter. Poorer by $20. Richer by something that had no price. Over the following weeks, Margaret's life found a new rhythm. Daniel called her every few days, updating her on his progress. He'd enrolled in an outpatient program, was attending therapy, working through the grief and addiction that had pulled him under. Sarah had helped him apply for teaching positions. Nothing had come through yet, but he was hopeful. He sounded hopeful. That was the important thing. "I'm swimming," he told her during one call. "Like you said? It's hard. But I'm swimming." "Good," Margaret replied. "Keep swimming." Sarah visited twice more. Brought Margaret groceries she insisted on paying for. Margaret protested, but Sarah was stubborn. "You gave my father back," Sarah said. "The least I can do is make sure you eat well." They became friends, Margaret and Sarah. An unlikely pair. 40 years apart in age. But connected by Daniel. By love. By the understanding that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you need them most. Margaret also started seeing Robert around the neighborhood. He'd taken her advice. Gone to Rosie's. Linda, bless her, had fed him and called a social worker she knew. Robert was now in a shelter program, working toward permanent housing. He waved when he saw Margaret. Small gestures of recognition. Proof that he was still there. Still trying. November arrived. Then December. The city dressed itself in holiday lights and false cheer. Margaret had always hated the holidays after Henry died. They amplified loneliness. Made absence echo louder. But this year felt different. She had Daniel's calls. Sarah's visits. The memory of helping. The ring on her finger reminded her love persisted. 3 days before Christmas, Margaret was coming home from the store when she saw a commotion near her building. Police cars. An ambulance. Neighbors clustered on the sidewalk, speaking in low, urgent voices. Her stomach dropped. Something bad had happened. You live long enough in a city, you know that look. That energy. Tragedy in progress. She pushed through the small crowd. "What happened?" "Mrs. Morrison in 4B, someone said. Heart attack, they think." Her son found her. Mrs. Morrison. Elderly. Lived alone. Margaret had spoken to her a few times in the hallway. Nice woman. Quiet. Always had a kind word. Margaret watched as paramedics brought out a stretcher. Mrs. Morrison was alive but barely. Oxygen mask? 4 already in. The paramedics moved with controlled urgency. Every second mattered. "She lives alone?" One paramedic asked the crowd. "Yes," someone answered. "No family here. I think she has a son in California." "Someone needs to go with her," the paramedic said. "The hospital won't let her be alone. She's in bad shape." "Anyone here close to her?" Silence. Neighbors looking at each other. All the unspoken calculations. Who had time? Who had the capacity? Who cared enough to spend hours in an emergency room with someone else's mother? Margaret stepped forward. "I'll go." The paramedic looked at her. Assessed quickly. "Are you family?" "I'm her neighbor. And I'm a retired nurse. I can help." "Okay. Get in." Margaret climbed into the ambulance. Sat beside Mrs. Morrison, who was unconscious, her face gray and pinched. Margaret took her hand. The same hand she'd held hundreds of times in hospice. The hand needed to know someone was there. That they weren't alone in the darkness. "I'm here," Margaret said softly. "You're not alone. I'm right here." The ambulance screamed through city streets. Lights flashing. Siren wailing. Margaret held Mrs. Morrison's hand and talked to her. Soft reassurances. Gentle words. The paramedic worked efficiently. Checking vitals. Adjusting oxygen. Radioing ahead to the hospital. "You're good at this," he said to Margaret. "I've had practice." At the hospital, They rushed Mrs. Morrison into emergency cardiac care. Margaret followed as far as they'd let her. Gave the nurses what information she had. Stayed in the waiting room when they pushed through the doors that said authorized personnel only. The waiting room was depressingly familiar. Fluorescent lights. Plastic chairs. The smell of disinfectant trying to mask fear. Margaret had spent so much of her nursing career in spaces like this. Now she was on the other side. The one waiting. The one hoping. She called Mrs. Morrison's son from the nurse's station. They tracked down his number. He answered on the third ring. "Hello? Is this David Morrison?" "Yes." "Who's this?" "My name is Margaret Chen. I'm your mother's neighbor. I'm at Mercy Hospital with her. She's had a heart attack. She's in emergency cardiac care right now." Silence. "Then is she going to make it?" "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "But she's getting good care. Can you come?" "I'm in San Francisco. I can catch the first flight out. Tomorrow morning at the earliest. Can you stay with her? Please? She shouldn't be alone." "I'll stay," Margaret promised. "As long as it takes." "Thank you." "God, thank you." Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm coming." "I will." Margaret hung up and went back to the waiting room. Hours passed. Slow and syrupy, the way hospital time moves. She dozed occasionally. Woke with a stiff neck. Drank terrible coffee from a vending machine. Watched nurses change shifts. Saw other families come and go, their dramas playing out in whispers and tears. Finally, around 2 a.m., a doctor came out. Young. Tired. But smiling slightly. "Are you here for Eleanor Morrison?" "Yes." "How is she?" "Stable. She's incredibly lucky. Another hour and we'd be having a different conversation. She's going to need surgery. Probably a bypass. But she's conscious now." "Asking for someone named Margaret?" "That's me. She can have one visitor." 5 minutes. Margaret followed the doctor through the labyrinth of emergency ward corridors. Machines beeping. Phones ringing. The controlled chaos of life being fought for. Mrs. Morrison's room was small and stark. She looked tiny in the bed. Wires and tubes everywhere. But her eyes were open. Alert. "Margaret?" she said weakly. "I'm here." Margaret took her hand. The ring on her finger caught the harsh hospital light. "You came with me." "Of course I did." "Why?" The eternal question. Why would someone care? "Because you needed someone," Margaret said simply. "And I was there. Your son is flying in tomorrow. He said to tell you he loves you." Tears leaked from Mrs. Morrison's eyes. "I thought I was alone. Thought I'd die alone in that apartment." "You're not alone. Not now. Not ever if I have anything to say about it." Mrs. Morrison squeezed her hand. "That's a beautiful ring." Margaret looked at it. Sarah's mother's ring. The ring that had replaced the one she'd sold. "It is. It reminds me that we carry each other. Through the hard things. Through the darkness. We carry each other." "Yes," Mrs. Morrison whispered. "Yes, we do." The nurse came to check vitals. Margaret's 5 minutes were up. She squeezed Mrs. Morrison's hand one more time. "I'll be in the waiting room. And I'll be here when your son arrives. You're not alone." "Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for seeing me." Margaret went back to the waiting room. Curled up in 2 plastic chairs pushed together. Slept fitfully until dawn broke through the windows. She woke to her phone ringing. "Sarah." "Margaret? Dad said you weren't answering your door. Are you okay?" Margaret explained about Mrs. Morrison. The heart attack. The hospital. "You've been there all night?" Sarah asked, incredulous. "Someone had to be. I'm coming to bring you breakfast. And don't argue. You helped my father. Now let me help you." An hour later, Sarah arrived with coffee and bagels. They sat in the waiting room together. Sarah told her about Daniel. He'd gotten a job. Part-time at first. teaching GD classes at a community center. It wasn't high school English, but it was teaching. He'd called her crying after his first day. Happy tears. Grateful tears. The tears of a man who'd found his purpose again. He said it's because of you, Sarah told Margaret. That you reminded him who he was. Who he could be again. He reminded himself, Margaret said. I just witnessed it. David Morrison arrived at 10 a.m. haggard from the red-eye flight. Terrified. Margaret met him in the lobby. Introduced herself. Took him to his mother. She watched them embrace. Watched his relief when he saw she was alive. Conscious. Going to recover. Before she left, David found her in the hallway. Thank you for staying with her. The nurses said you were here all night. That you rode in the ambulance. That you held her hand. Thank you for caring about a stranger. She's not a stranger, Margaret said. She's my neighbor. And neighbors take care of each other. At least they should. She left the hospital as morning gave way to afternoon. Exhausted. Dirty. But satisfied. She'd made a difference. Again. Had shown up when someone needed her. Had proven to herself that she still had value. Still had purpose. That retirement from nursing hadn't meant retirement from caring. On the bus home, an elderly man offered her his seat. She must have looked as tired as she felt. She thanked him and sat. Looked at her ring. It had witnessed a lot in the short time she'd worn it. Breakfast with Daniel. Late nights talking about grief. The ambulance ride. The hospital vigil. This ring was collecting its own stories now. Its own history. Different from Henry's ring but equally meaningful. When she got home, she showered. Slept for 4 hours. Woke to darkness and several missed calls. Daniel. Sarah. And one from a number she didn't recognize. She called the unknown number first. A woman answered. Professional voice. Is this Margaret Chen? Yes. Mrs. Chen, my name is Patricia Alvarez. I'm a social worker with the city. Your name has come up several times recently. In connection with people you've helped. Daniel Morrison. Robert Franklin. Eleanor Morrison. There seem to be stories about you. About the way you show up for people. Margaret felt confused. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, people are noticing. Other social workers. Shelter staff. Hospital personnel. You're building a reputation, Mrs. Chen. For being someone who helps. Who sees people others miss. And I wanted to ask, have you ever considered volunteering? We have programs that desperately need people like you. People with nursing backgrounds. People with compassion. People who actually give a damn. Margaret sat down slowly. Volunteering? Yes. With homeless outreach. Or hospital companion programs. Or senior services. Places that need exactly what you seem to give naturally. Presence. Dignity. Care. I never thought about it. Would you think about it now? We could use you, Mrs. Chen. The city could use you. After they hung up, Margaret sat in her dark apartment thinking. Volunteering. She'd spent 30 years as a nurse. Then Henry died, and she retreated. Shrunk her world down to her apartment, and her routine and her grief. But the last month had shown her something. She wasn't done. Her capacity to care hadn't retired. If anything, it had grown stronger. More focused. Distilled down to its essence. She called Patricia back. Yes, she said. I'll volunteer. Tell me where to start. And so Margaret began the next chapter. She signed up with the hospital companion program. 2 days a week, she sat with patients who had no family. Held hands. Read books aloud. Provided the presence that heals as much as any medicine. She joined the homeless outreach team. Once a week, walking the streets with social workers, handing out supplies, making connections, and seeing people the way she'd seen Daniel. She wasn't paid. Didn't need to be. Her pension covered rent and food. This work fed something else. The part of her that needed to matter. To make a difference. to justify taking up space in the world. Daniel came to visit on a cold Saturday in January. He looked healthy, clear-eyed, 20 pounds heavier. His daughter had helped him find an apartment. Small but his. He'd been sober for 2 months. Was still teaching GD classes. Talking about maybe going back to school. Getting the credentials to teach high school again. They sat in Margaret's apartment drinking coffee. She showed him the volunteer ID badge she wore when working with the outreach team. He smiled at it. "Look at you. Saving more people." "Trying to," Margaret said. "That's all we can do. Try." "That's all you did for me," Daniel said. "You tried. You showed up. You saw me when I was invisible. And it changed everything." He reached into his pocket. Pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. "I wanted to give you this. It's not much. But it felt important." Margaret unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a book. Old. Worn. A collection of poetry. She opened the cover and saw an inscription in faded ink. "To Daniel, may you always find beauty in words. Love, Mom." "This was my mother's," Daniel said. "She gave it to me when I graduated college. When I decided to become an English teacher. I kept it through everything. Through losing my wife. Through the drinking. Through being homeless. This book was the one thing I never sold or lost. Because it reminded me who I wanted to be." Margaret ran her fingers over the inscription. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can. Because you reminded me who I wanted to be too. You gave me back my life. The least I can do is give you something that matters. This book represents hope. Second chances. The belief that beauty exists, even in darkness. That's what you gave me. So now I'm giving it to you." Margaret looked at the book. At Daniel. At the ring on her finger. At the volunteer badge on her table. At the tapestry of kindness that had woven itself through the last 3 months. One breakfast. One ring sold. One life saved. And now this. A circle completing itself. Love passing forward and back. A chain of caring that connected strangers across time. "Thank you," she said. "This means more than you know." After Daniel left, Margaret opened the poetry book. Flipped through pages marked with age and love. Found a poem by Mary Oliver. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell about it. She read it 3 times. Let the words sink in. This was what she'd been doing. Paying attention. Being astonished by human resilience. Telling about it through her actions. Through showing up. Through caring when it would be easier not to. She thought about Henry. About what he'd think of all this. The ring she'd sold. The ring she'd received. The people she'd helped. The life she'd built from the ashes of grief. He'd be proud. She knew this was certainty. Henry had always believed in her. In her capacity to love. To heal. To see people drowning and throw them a rope. "I'm doing it, Henry," she whispered to the photograph on the mantel. "I'm paying attention. I'm being astonished. I'm telling about it the best way I know how." The photograph didn't answer. But she felt him there. In the apartment. In her heart. In every choice she made. Henry wasn't gone. He was woven into everything she did. Every person she helped. Every hand she held. He was there. Always. February came. Margaret celebrated her 68th birthday alone. But it didn't feel lonely. She had Daniel calling to wish her happy birthday. Sarah is stopping by with a cake. Mrs. Morrison, recovered from surgery, knocking on her door with flowers. Robert Franklin leaving a handmade card in her mailbox, his handwriting shaky but sincere. "Thank you for seeing me. You saved my life." Margaret put the card on her refrigerator. Next to the volunteer schedule. Next to a photograph Sarah had taken of her and Daniel at Rosie's diner, back where it all started. She looked at this collection of evidence. Proof that her life mattered. That she mattered. Not because of grand gestures. But because of small moments. Breakfast bought. Hands held. Presents offered. That evening, she volunteered at the hospital. Sat with a man dying of cancer. No family. Just Margaret and machines and the quiet dignity of being witnessed. She held his hand. Told him about Henry. About love lasting beyond death. About how we carry each other forward. The man died at 11:47 p.m. Peacefully. With Margaret holding his hand. She'd done this hundreds of times as a nurse. But it felt different now. More sacred. Like she was fulfilling not just a duty but a calling. She was the rope. For people drowning in loneliness. In sickness. In despair. She was the hand that held on. The voice that said, "You're not alone." Walking home that night, the city quiet and cold around her, Margaret looked at her ring. It caught the streetlight. Gold and simple and heavy with meaning. 2 women's love stories wrapped around her finger. Henry's devotion. Daniel's wife's commitment. Both carried forward by her. Both honored in the life she was living. She thought about the pawn shop. The moment she'd placed Henry's ring on the counter. How scared she'd been. How certain she was of losing something irreplaceable. But she'd gained so much more. She'd gained purpose. Connection. A reminder that objects matter less than actions. Those gold bands are symbols, beautiful and meaningful, but the real treasure is what we do with our time. How we show up. Who we help. How we love. Margaret got home and made tea. Sat by her window. Watched the city sleep. She'd lost a ring and gained a life. Had sold gold and bought redemption. For Daniel. For herself. For every person she'd helped since. The math didn't make sense on paper. But it made perfect sense in her heart. She'd learned something crucial these past months. Grief doesn't end. You don't get over losing someone you loved for 43 years. But grief can coexist with purpose. With joy. With new connections and meaningful work. You carry both. The love and the loss. The memories and the moments. You move forward, not on. You take your dead with you into every day. Every choice. Every act of kindness. Henry was in the volunteer work. At breakfast she'd bought Daniel. In the hand she'd held in the ambulance. In the poetry book on her shelf. In the ring on her finger that wasn't his but carried his spirit. He was everywhere. Because love doesn't end. It transforms. Becomes action. Becomes legacy. It becomes the way you live after they're gone. Margaret sipped her tea and felt at peace. She'd spent 3 years in limbo. Treading water. Waiting to drown. But selling that ring had been her first stroke toward shore. And every person she'd helped since was another stroke. She was swimming now. Really swimming. Not away from Henry. But towards something new while carrying him with her. The ring on her finger caught the moonlight through her window. Margaret smiled at it. At the impossible journey it represented. At the chain of love and loss and redemption that had brought it to her hand. She'd sold a wedding ring to feed a stranger. And that stranger had led her back to life. Sometimes the most sacred things we own are meant to be given away. Not lost. Transformed. Turned into something greater than gold. Turned into hope. Into help. Into the hands we hold in darkness. Into the presence that says you matter. You're seen. You're not alone. Margaret finished her tea. Went to bed. Slept deeply. Dreamed of Henry. In the dream, he was young again. They were at the courthouse on their wedding day. He was putting the ring on her finger. But when she looked down, it was Sarah's mother's ring. And Henry was smiling. Perfect, he said in the dream. It's perfect. She woke with tears on her face. Happy tears. Grateful tears. The tears of someone who'd been drowning and found they could breathe again. Spring came. Then summer. Margaret continued volunteering. Continued showing up. Continued being the rope for people drowning. She met dozens of people. Heard hundreds of stories. Some people she could help. Some she couldn't. But she tried. Every time. That was the promise she'd made to herself. To Henry. To the memory of who they'd been together. She would try. Daniel got his teaching license reinstated. Got hired at a high school. Inner city. Tough kids. But he loved it. Called Margaret after his first week. "I'm doing it," he said, voice full of wonder. "I'm teaching poetry again." And one kid said my class made him want to read. That's enough. That one kid. That's everything. Yes, Margaret agreed. That's everything. Sarah got engaged. Invited Margaret to the wedding. Margaret went and cried happy tears. Watched Sarah marry a kind man who looked at her the way Henry used to look at Margaret. With devotion. With certainty. With the kind of love that weathers storms. At the reception, Sarah pulled Margaret aside. "I want you to know," Sarah said, "that meeting you changed my life. You gave me my father back. And in doing that, you taught me what love looks like. Real love. Not romantic love. Although that's important. But the kind of love that shows up. That's a sacrifice. That sells wedding rings to feed strangers. That's the love I want in my marriage. That's the example you set." Margaret hugged her. This young woman had become like a daughter. "You already have that love," she whispered. "I see it in you. You carry your mother's love. Your father's. And now your husband's. You're going to be fine." Mrs. Morrison recovered fully. Stayed in touch with Margaret. They had coffee once a week. Talked about aging. About loss. About learning to live alone without being lonely. Mrs. Morrison started volunteering too. At a library. Reading to children. Finding purpose in her retirement. "You inspired me," she told Margaret. "Showed me it's not too late to matter." "It's never too late," Margaret said. Robert Franklin got housing. A small studio apartment. Got a job at a grocery store. Stayed sober. Stopped by Margaret's building sometimes just to say hello. To prove he was still swimming. Still trying. "You showed me I mattered," he said once. "When the whole world said I didn't. You looked at me and said I did. That saved my life." "You saved your own life," Margaret told him. "You chose to swim. I just cheered from the shore." But Robert shook his head. "No. You threw me a rope. There's a difference." Margaret thought about that conversation for days. About ropes and drowning and the difference between saving someone and witnessing their choice to be saved. Maybe it was both. Maybe salvation was always a collaboration. One person drowning. One person seeing. Both choosing to reach out. In August, Margaret got a call from Patricia Alvarez, the social worker. "I have someone I want you to meet," she said. Another nurse. Retired. Just lost her husband. She's struggling. Considering volunteering but scared to start. "Would you talk to her? Share your story?" Margaret agreed. Met the woman, Linda, at a cafe. Linda was 70. Newly widowed. Lost. Margaret recognized the expression. The drowning eyes. She'd seen them in her mirror 3 years ago. They talked for 2 hours. Margaret told her everything. Henry. The grief. The loneliness. The day she saw Daniel. The decision to sell her ring. What came after. How helping others had helped her. How purpose had pulled her back from the edge. Linda cried. "I don't know if I can do this. If I'm strong enough." "You are," Margaret said with certainty. "I thought I wasn't either. But you are. The strength is already there. You just have to point it in the right direction. Will you help me? Will you show me how?" Margaret reached across the table and took Linda's hand. Felt the naked ring finger. The recent widow's mark. "Yes," she said. "I'll show you. You're not alone. Not anymore." Linda started volunteering the next week. Margaret went with her the first few times. Showed her the ropes. Introduced her to people. Watched as Linda transformed from drowning to swimming. From lost to found. From empty to purposeful. It was like watching her own journey reflected. Proof that the pattern repeated. That kindness echoed. That rope thrown eventually led to other ropes thrown. On and on. A chain of caring stretching across the city. September arrived. 1 year since Margaret had sold her ring. She marked the anniversary quietly. Went to Rosie's diner. Sat in the booth where she'd bought Daniel breakfast. Linda, the waitress, remembered. "It's been a year," Linda said. "Since you brought in that homeless man. Changed his whole life." "He changed mine too," Margaret said. "I see you here sometimes with other people. Always different people. Always someone who looks like they need a friend. You're doing something good, Margaret. Something that matters." Margaret ordered coffee. Sat in the booth. Thought about the year. The people. The moments. The transformation from grief to purpose. From alone to connected. From drowning to swimming. She'd sold a ring and bought a life. Not just for Daniel. For herself. For Robert. For Mrs. Morrison. For Linda. For everyone who'd crossed her path and found in her a rope. A hand. A witness to their struggle. She looked at the ring on her finger. Sarah's mother's ring. It had its own story now. A year of volunteering. Of hands held. Of presences offered. Of moments witnessed. This ring had been in ambulances and hospital rooms and homeless shelters and nursing homes. It had touched more lives than its original owner could have imagined. It was living a second life. Like Margaret. Like Daniel. Like everyone who'd been given a second chance. When she left the diner, Margaret walked to the pawn shop. The same one where she'd sold Henry's ring a year ago. She stood outside looking in the window. Wondering. Was it still there? After a year, probably not. Someone had probably bought it. I am wearing it right now. Living their own story. But curiosity pulled her inside. The same bored clerk behind the counter. The same smell of old leather and desperation. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked. "I sold a ring here. A year ago. Gold band. 14 karat. Simple. I was wondering, is it still here?" The clerk looked skeptical. "We sell rings all the time. What makes you think yours is still here?" "I don't. But I'd like to look. If that's okay." He shrugged. Led her to a display case. Dozens of rings. Gold and silver. Plain and ornate. Stories piled on top of stories. Margaret scanned them. Not expecting to find it. But needing to look. And there. Third row. Simple gold band. Worn thin in places. Scratched. Beautiful. "That one," Margaret said, voice shaking. "Can I see that one?" The clerk retrieved it. Handed it to her. She looked inside the band. Saw the inscription Henry had added on their 10th anniversary. "Forever, Maggie." It was hers. Henry's ring. Still here. Waiting. For a year. Like it knew she'd come back. "How much?" she asked. The clerk checked the tag. 300. More than she'd gotten for it. Of course. That's how pawnshops work. You sell low. Buy high. Margaret thought about her bank account. About whether she could afford it. About whether she should afford it. She'd moved on. Had a new ring. A new life. Did she need this back? But the inscription. "Forever, Maggie." Forever wasn't done. "I'll take it," she said. She paid with her credit card. Money she didn't really have. Would need to be careful the next few months to pay it off. But worth it. Absolutely worth it. Outside, Margaret held both rings. Henry and Sarah's mother's. 2 love stories. 2 lives. Both are hers now. She didn't know what to do with them. Wear both. Keep one as a backup? She stood on the sidewalk, staring at these circles of gold, trying to decide. Then she knew. She went to the nearest jewelry store. Asked them to solder the rings together. Fuse them. Make 1 ring from 2. The jeweler looked at them. "They're different carats," he said. "Different gold. It'll be tricky." "Can you do it?" "Yeah." "But why?" "They're each beautiful alone." "Because love doesn't exist in isolation," Margaret said. "It's always connected. These rings represent different people. Different stories. But they're part of the same story now. My story, and I want them together. The jeweler smiled. I like that. Give me 2 days. 2 days later, Margaret picked up her ring. Ring. It was strange looking. The two bands soldered together. Not matching but intentional. Beautiful in its asymmetry. The jeweler had done good work. The join was clean. Strong. You could see where one ended and the other began. But they were one now. Inseparable. Margaret slipped it on her finger. Heavier than before. But right. This was her marriage to Henry. And her marriage to the life she'd built after. Both honored. Both carried. Both forward. She called Daniel that night. Told him about the ring. About finding Henry's ring at the pawn shop. About having them join. That's beautiful, Daniel said. That's exactly right. You didn't choose between your old life and your new life. You combined them. Yes, Margaret agreed. That's exactly what I did. Thank you, Daniel said suddenly. For everything. For breakfast. For showing me I mattered. For being the reason I'm alive and sober and teaching and living. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for letting me see you, Margaret replied. Thank you for being someone worth saving. We all are, Daniel said softly. That's what you taught me. We're all worth saving. We just need someone to notice we're drowning. After they hung up, Margaret sat with her joined rings, feeling their weight. She thought about the journey. About how selling one ring had led to receiving another. About how both had led her back to herself. To purpose. To the life Henry would have wanted her to live. Not trapped in grief, but transformed by it. Made stronger. More compassionate. More willing to see the drowning and throw the rope. October returned. The anniversary month. 2 years since Margaret first saw Daniel in that doorway. It had been 1 year since she'd sold the ring. Now, with both rings reunited and joined, she felt complete. Not whole. You're never whole again after losing someone who was half your soul. But complete. Finished with one chapter. Ready for the next. She continued volunteering. The hospital companion program. The homeless outreach. She'd added a third commitment now. Mentoring newly widowed women through a grief support program. Women like Linda. Like she'd been. Lost and drowning and needing someone to show them how to swim again. Every Tuesday evening, she met with a group of 5 women. All recent widows. All struggling. They sat in a church basement and talked about loss. About emptiness. About how to keep living when the person you lived for is gone. Margaret listened. Shared her story. Showed them her joined rings and explained what they meant. 2 lives. 1 forward motion. Love that persists. One woman, Carol, was particularly struggling. Her husband had died 6 months ago. She'd stopped eating properly. Stopped seeing friends. Was considering selling her house. Moving somewhere new. Starting over. Running from the grief. I just want to forget, Carol said one evening. I want to stop hurting. You can't forget, Margaret said gently. And you shouldn't try. The pain means something. It's proof you love deeply. That's not something to run from. It's something to carry. But how? Carol asked, tears streaming. How do you carry this weight without drowning? Margaret looked at her rings. Thought about Daniel. About all the drowning people she'd encountered. About the difference between sinking and swimming. You find purpose, Margaret said. You find something outside yourself that needs you. Someone who's drowning worse than you are. And you throw them a rope. Not because it fixes your grief. But because it reminds you that you still matter. That you can still help. That your life isn't over just because half of it died. Carol stared at her. How do I do that? I can barely get out of bed. You start small, Margaret said. You start with 1 breakfast. 1 stranger. 1 moment of seeing someone else's pain and deciding to do something about it. Even when you're broken. Especially when you're broken. Because broken people understand drowning better than anyone. Did it work for you? Carol asked. Margaret thought about Daniel teaching high school English again. About Sarah's wedding. About Robert in his apartment. About Mrs. Morrison reading to children at the library. About Linda volunteering beside her. About the chain of caring that had started with one sold ring and one breakfast, and had rippled outward in ways she never could have predicted. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "It saved my life." Carol started volunteering the next month. At an animal shelter. Walking dogs that had been abandoned. Broken creatures helping broken creatures. Margaret watched her transformation. Slow but steady. From drowning to treading water to eventually swimming. The pattern repeated. The rope was thrown. Another life saved. November brought Margaret's first Thanksgiving without Henry, where she didn't feel completely alone. She hosted dinner at her small apartment. Daniel and Sarah came. Sarah's husband. Mrs. Morrison from upstairs. Linda, her fellow volunteer. Robert Franklin, who brought a pie he made himself. Carol from the grief group. The apartment was crowded and loud and chaotic and perfect. They went around the table sharing what they were grateful for. When it came to Margaret, she looked at the faces around her. These people who'd been strangers. Who'd become family. This makeshift tribe was built on shared pain and shared healing. "I'm grateful for drowning," she said. Everyone looked confused. She smiled. "I'm grateful that 2 years ago, I was drowning. Lost in grief. Invisible to myself. Because if I hadn't been drowning, I wouldn't have recognized it in Daniel. Wouldn't have seen someone who needed a rope. And if I hadn't thrown that rope, none of you would be here. None of this would exist. So I'm grateful for the drowning. Because it taught me how to swim. And once I learned, I could teach others." She held up her hand, showing the joined rings. These rings represent love. But also loss. Also survival. Also, the choice to keep swimming even when drowning seems easier. I'm grateful for every hard moment that brought me here. To this table. With all of you. Daniel raised his glass. To drowning. And to the people who throw ropes. Everyone raised their glasses. To drowning. They ate and laughed and told stories. Margaret watched it all, her heart full in a way she'd forgotten was possible. This was what Henry had wanted for her. Not to move on, but to move forward. To build a life that honored their past while embracing the future. To love again. Not romantically, but deeply. The love that shows up. That sees people. That throws ropes. After everyone left, Margaret cleaned up. Washed dishes. Put away leftovers. Her apartment was quiet again. But it wasn't lonely. The walls held echoes of laughter. The table held crumbs of connection. She wasn't alone. Not really. Even when no one else was here. She made tea and sat by her window. Looked at the city lights. Thought about all the people out there drowning. In grief. In addition. In loneliness. In poverty. In despair. So many drowning people. Not enough ropes. But she was one rope. Daniel was another. Sarah. Linda. Carol. Robert. Mrs. Morrison. All of them are throwing ropes now. All of them passing forward what had been given to them. The chain of caring is growing longer. Reaching further. Touching more lives. One person couldn't save everyone. Henry had been right about that. But one person could save someone. And that someone could save someone else. And on and on. A chain of salvation stretching across the city. Across time. Proof that kindness compounds. That help multiplies. That love persists. December arrived with early snow. The city transformed into something cleaner. Softer. The harsh edges buried under white. Margaret loved winter. Always had. There was something honest about it. The way it stripped everything down to essentials. Survival. Warmth. Connection. You couldn't fake it in winter. You either helped each other or you froze. She was walking home from a hospital shift one evening, her volunteer badge still clipped to her coat, when she saw a young woman sitting on a bench. Early 20s, maybe? Crying. Not the quiet crying of someone who doesn't want to be noticed. The desperate crying of someone past caring who sees them. Margaret almost walked past. It was cold. She was tired. She'd been at the hospital for 6 hours, sitting with a dying man who had no one else. Her feet hurt. Her back ached. She wanted her apartment, her tea, her window, her rest. But she thought about Daniel. About that first moment she'd seen him and walked past. About the 48 hours of guilt before she went back. About how different everything would be if she'd kept walking. She sat down on the bench. "Are you okay?" The young woman looked at her, eyes red and swollen. "Do I look okay?" "No," Margaret said honestly. "You look like you're drowning." Something flickered in the woman's expression. Recognition, maybe? "I am," she whispered. "I really am." "What happened?" And the story came out. The young woman, her name was Emma, had just left the hospital. Her mother had died an hour ago. Cancer. Fast and brutal. Emma was alone. No other family. No partner. Just her and her grief and a city full of strangers who didn't care. "I don't know what to do," Emma said. "I don't know how to be in the world without her. She was everything. My mom, my best friend, my only family. And now she's gone, and I'm drowning." Margaret felt it. The weight of that loss. The particular agony of losing a mother. She'd lost her own mother 20 years ago. It never quite healed. You just learned to live around the wound. "I'm so sorry," Margaret said, and meant it with her whole heart. "How do you survive this?" Emma asked. "How do you keep going when everything good is gone?" Margaret thought about Henry. About 3 years after he died. About Daniel and the breakfast and the rings and everything that came after. About learning to swim. About finding purpose in helping others swim. "You start by breathing," Margaret said. "Just breathing. That's all you have to do today. Breathe. Get through the next hour. Then the next. Don't think about tomorrow or next week, or how you'll live the rest of your life. Just breathe. Right now. Can you do that?" Emma nodded slowly. "Good. That's enough for today. Tomorrow, you breathe again. And eventually, breathing becomes easier. And once breathing is easier, you start swimming. Small strokes. One at a time. You're not trying to reach shore yet. You're just trying to stay afloat." "Did you lose someone?" Emma asked. Margaret held up her hand. Showed the joined rings. "My husband. 3 years ago. I was drowning too. Completely underwater. But someone threw me a rope. And I grabbed it. And eventually I learned to swim again." "How long did it take?" "I'm still learning," Margaret admitted. "It's not a destination. It's a practice. Some days I swim better than others. Some days I still feel like I'm drowning. But I keep swimming. Because the alternative is sinking. And I'm not ready to sink." Emma wiped her eyes. "I don't want to sink either." "Then don't." "Not today. Today you just breathe. And tomorrow you breathe again. And I'll give you my phone number. And when drowning feels too hard, when breathing feels impossible, you call me. Okay? You're not alone in this. Not anymore." Emma stared at her. "Why would you do that?" "You don't know me." "I know drowning," Margaret said. "And I know what it means when someone sees you. Really sees you. It matters. It saves lives. So I'm seeing you, Emma. You matter. Your grief matters. Your survival matters. And I'm here. Whenever you need a rope." Margaret wrote her phone number on a piece of paper. Handed it to Emma. "Call me. Anytime. I mean it." Emma took the paper. Held it like it was precious. "Thank you? I don't even know your name." "Margaret. Margaret Chen." "Thank you, Margaret. For stopping. For seeing me. For not letting me drown alone." They sat together for a while longer. Until Emma's breathing steadied. Until the crying stopped. until she looked less like someone drowning and more like someone treading water. Then Margaret walked her to the subway, made sure she got on safely, watched the train pull away, carrying Emma back to her life, her grief, her struggle. Margaret walked home thinking about circles, how life circled back, how she'd been Emma once, sitting alone with fresh grief, drowning, and now she was the one throwing ropes. The pattern is repeating. The chain continues. Love passing forward through time and strangers. Emma called 3 days later. At 2 a.m. Sobbing. Drowning. Margaret talked to her for an hour. Walked her through breathing. Through surviving the moment. Through choosing not to sink. It was exhausting, but necessary. This was the work. Holding hands in darkness. Being present for the drowning. Over the next weeks, Emma called frequently. Sometimes crying. Sometimes just needing to hear another voice. Margaret always answered. Always threw the rope. Always reminded Emma she wasn't alone. Slowly, Emma started swimming. Got through the funeral. Started sorting her mother's belongings. Returned to work. Small strokes. One at a time. Moving forward through the grief. One day in January, Emma called with different news. I volunteered, she said, at a hospice. I'm going to sit with terminal patients who don't have family. Like someone sat with my mom at the end. I want to be that for someone else. Margaret felt tears in her eyes. That's beautiful. You inspired me, Emma said. You showed me that even when you're drowning, you can still throw ropes. That helping others helps you survive your own pain. So I'm trying. I'm swimming and throwing ropes. Thank you for teaching me how. After they hung up, Margaret looked at her rings. Thought about the chain. Daniel is helping her. Her helping Emma. Emma helping hospice patients. On and on. Each person who learned to swim taught others. Each rope thrown leads to more ropes. Infinite circles of caring spreading outward. This was Henry's legacy. Not the ring. Not the money he'd saved. Not the things he'd built. But this. The way his love for her had taught her to love others. The way his death had transformed her grief into purpose. The way their marriage still mattered. Still affected the world. Still saved lives. Margaret walked to the mantel. Picked up Henry's photograph. Looked at his smile. His kind eyes. His face that she'd loved for 43 years and would love for whatever time she had left. Look what we did, she whispered to the photograph. Look at the lives we touched. You thought you were just loving me. Just buying me a ring. Just building a life together. But it was more than that. Your love created this. This chain of caring. These people are swimming instead of drowning. You did that, Henry. We did that. Together. Even now. Especially now. The photograph didn't answer. But she felt him. In the apartment. In her heart. In every rope she threw. Henry wasn't gone. He was transformed. Turned into action. Into legacy. Into love that persisted beyond death. February brought Margaret's 69th birthday. Another year older. Another year forward. She celebrated with her makeshift family. Daniel and Sarah. Emma. Linda. Carol. Robert. Mrs. Morrison. Her tribe of formerly drowning people who'd learned to swim. They gathered in her small apartment, bringing food and laughter and stories. They went around sharing how Margaret had impacted their lives. It was embarrassing and touching and overwhelming. You gave me my father back, Sarah said, and taught me what real love looks like. You reminded me I was human, Daniel said. Worth saving. Worth trying for. You showed me survival was possible, Emma said. That grief doesn't have to destroy you. That you can carry it and still live. You taught me purpose matters more than comfort, Linda said. That helping others helps yourself. One by one they shared. Each person's life changed by one breakfast. One sold ring. One moment of seeing someone drowning and choosing to throw a rope. Margaret listened, overwhelmed by the ripples. by the proof that small acts compound into large impacts. That one person choosing to care could change dozens of lives. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret held up her joined rings. These rings represent my journey. From drowning to swimming. From grief to purpose. From alone to connected. I sold one ring to feed a stranger. And that stranger led me to all of you. To this life. To this family. It was the best trade I ever made. She paused, looking at each face. These people who'd been strangers. Who'd become her reason for swimming. Thank you, she said, voice thick with emotion. Thank you for letting me help you. For grabbing the ropes I threw. For learning to swim and then teaching others. Thank you for proving that love persists. That kindness matters. That we can carry each other through the hardest things. You've given my life meaning. And that's the greatest gift I've ever received. They toasted. Ate cake. Told stories late into the night. Margaret's apartment had never felt so full. So alive. So much like a home. After everyone left, Margaret stood at her window. Looked at the city. Thought about all the drowning people out there. The ones she'd helped. The ones she hadn't met yet. The endless need for ropes and witnesses and people willing to see the invisible. She was 69. Wouldn't live forever. Maybe another decade. Maybe two if she was lucky. But whatever time she had left, she'd spend it swimming. Throwing ropes. Being present for the drowning. It wasn't a perfect life. But it was a meaningful one. And meaning mattered more than perfection. Margaret touched her rings. Felt their weight. Their history. Their promise. Two love stories. Henry's and hers. His death and her rebirth. Both honored. Both carried. Both living on in everything she did. She thought about the young woman in the pawnshop that day 2 years ago. How scared she'd been. How certain she was of losing something irreplaceable. How wrong she'd been. You can't lose love. You can only transform it. Turn it into action. Into legacy. Into ropes thrown and hands held and lives saved. I'm still swimming, Henry, she whispered to the night. Still throwing ropes. Still honoring us. Every day. In every person I help. You're still here. Still loving me. Still guiding me. And I'm still loving you. Forever, like you promised. Like the inscription said. Forever. The city glittered below. Full of drowning people. Full of potential ropes. Full of moments waiting to become miracles. Margaret smiled. Tomorrow she'd wake up. Volunteer at the hospital. Sit with someone dying. Hold their hand. Be their witness. Throw them a rope in the form of presence. Of dignity. Of the simple knowledge that someone saw them. Someone cared. Someone chose not to let them drown alone. This was her life now. This was Henry's legacy. This was love persisting beyond death. Beyond grief. Beyond rings sold and rings received and rings joined together. This was what mattered. Not the gold. But what the gold had purchased. Not the object. But the action. She'd sold her wedding ring to feed a stranger. And in doing so, she'd fed her own soul. Had saved her own life while saving others. Had learned that sometimes the most sacred things we own are meant to be given away. Transformed. Turned into something greater than jewelry. Turned into hope. Into help. Into the hands we hold in darkness. Margaret went to bed that night at peace. Tomorrow would bring more drowning people. More opportunities to throw ropes. More chances to prove that love persists. That kindness compounds. That one person choosing to see another can change everything. She fell asleep with her hands folded over her chest, the joined rings catching moonlight from the window. 2 bands of gold. 2 love stories. 1 life lived forward. 1 woman swimming. 1 heart still beating. Still caring. Still choosing to see the drowning and throw the rope. Again and again and again. Forever. The most sacred things we own aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to be transformed into acts of love that ripple far beyond what we can imagine, teaching us that we honor the dead not by clinging to their memory, but by living lives worthy of their love.